I'll start a bit of an introduction. Good afternoon to you all, or good day, pardon, or good evening. It is a great pleasure to introduce John Hobson. Folks, consider multi-generational scholarship. It happens often. Multi-generational scholarship on one theme that is 120 years reflection on imperialism, well, that is remarkable. And John also graduates from Eurocentrism and Eurochauvinism to Eurofetishism. So we are really getting an upgrade here. And I think, John, your work is also multi-generational in another sense, that it shows different waves and generations of criticism of imperialism, specifically British imperialism. We go from Marx to the imperialism of free trade, a la Friedrich List to Huiyuan Chang, and now Sashi Tharoor and the Deindustrialization thesis, which you then criticize as and uncover a lot of agency. And of course, this is in the lineage, in the line of Janet Abou-Lugat, André Gunners Frank, and many others who've been working on this. And the levels of agency that you show are really very, very profound and very engaging. Jerry Cohen, you have been writing about John Hobson. John Hobson has been writing about you, so it's a great pleasure that you are also joining us as a discussant. Marvelous. Welcome, a warm welcome to you all. Thanks for joining. Please join. Over to you.
Okay, Jan, thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me. And I'm also really grateful to Professor Cohen for so kindly agreeing to be the discussant. As you know, the talk today is based on my book that goes by the same title, Multicultural Origins of the Global Economy. I didn't realize just how much I'd put into that book until I tried to summarize it into a talk. And I realized that there are large chunks that I just can't go through. For example, the question, why did Britain initiate the industrialization and India and China didn't, given that India and China had been long ahead of Britain for a very long time. And I don't have time to talk about global historical capitalism versus global modern capitalism, but such are the limits. I shall move swiftly on. So what I want to do is start by discussing the opening chapter. So the introduction chapter is really just a sort of conceptual positioning framework. And I do quite a lot in there, and some of that I won't discuss, but I just want to focus on some of the core points. As you might imagine with a title such as this, the rationale for the book is that most studies of globalization and the global economy, I think, are highly Western-centric or Eurocentric, and this infects not just liberal approaches, but also many of those on the left, which is probably more interesting, including a lot of Marxists and, surprisingly, a lot of post-colonialists. And the beef here is that, you know, the West is imbibed or imbued with this kind of monopoly of hyper-agency, such that the West is the sole creator of everything modern and everything global. And that globalization is really just a shorthand for Westernization. Don't misunderstand me. It'd be folly to pretend that the West hasn't been important. It clearly has, but I think its importance has been considerably exaggerated. The actual book tries to look at the interconnections between Western and non-Western agents. But here I'm actually going to sort of rehabilitate the non-Western side of the agential formula that I work within, of which more shortly, because we've heard the story about the West for donkey's years. And there's absolutely nothing new, I believe, that anybody could ever say about Western agency in the creation of the modern global economy. I've yet to see it. So I'm going to focus more on non-Western agency, not because I believe that Western agency is unimportant. So I just wanted to get that rider in. Now, although the book is multidisciplinary, it's covering a lot of different disciplines, I elected to situate it or locate it within IPE in the opening chapter. And I call it a new global political economy, which will immediately raise eyebrows. But I should say that I call it new global political economy, not as a function of any hubris on my part, but really as a means of signaling the approach's position within sort of existing variants of IPE. So more specifically, what I have in mind here are the kind of pioneering efforts of actually two of my departmental colleagues, Tony Payne and Andrew Gamble, who set up the journal New Political Economy. And I'm also heavily influenced by Craig Murphy and Roger Tooze's, I think, brilliant edited volume, The New International Political Economy. And my own approach builds on theirs, but what it adds is clearly a much more non-Eurocentric focus to what they do, even though it was kind of pregnant or implicit, certainly within the Murphy and Tooze book. I could have just called it global political economy, but I chose not to because I find that a lot of GPE in its critical and orthodox positions to be highly Western centric. So what are the essential components of NGPE? I single out three. And the first dovetails with the key arguments made by Benjamin Cohen, who I'm so happy to see here today in this frankly seminal, and it was a path-breaking 2008 book, International Political Economy, Historiography. Here for the first time, we have a really good historiography of IPE, and I was really delighted to see that book. And in there, he does many things, of course, but one of the things he does is laments the shrinkage or the contraction of the intellectual borders of American school of IPE, US IPE, in the last 2 decades or more, actually, particularly with the grip or hegemony of the liberal neoclassical economics paradigm known as open economy politics. So approving of US IPE's, frankly, undeniably greater methodological rigor compared to the British school, it is undeniable, but he also laments its narrowness, and he calls, therefore, for a bridge building exercise in which US school IPE joins hands with Brit school. On the basis that Brit school has, albeit a less rigorous approach, but nevertheless one that has a much bigger vision of the global economy, one that has a historical sensitivity and one that is open more to social and cultural analysis, free from econometric analysis. So while I have a lot of sympathy for this, I think there are two problems with the Brit school that prevent that laudable exercise from being achievable. First of all, surprisingly, since 2008, I think it would be fair to say that Brit school IPE has undertaken a great retreat into the present. It has become highly presentist, and the historical flow of actually US school IPE first wave, which I think was quite impressive, has gone. And its presentism is complemented, if that's the right word, by an ever narrowing vision of the global economy. And so it's thereby coming to suffer from the very same defects that Benjamin Cohen finds quite rightly in US school IPE under OEP hegemony. So the first objective of NGPE is to return us to the kind of big picture historical sociological analysis that was in vogue in the 70s and 80s. Running on from this is a second one. So Cohen talks about the really big question. And the really big question is to analyze globalization and global systemic change. Again, I obviously, in a book such as this, fully support this. I do it by analyzing the development of two global economies. The first global economy, very roughly 1500 to 1850, and the second global economy, very roughly, 1850 to the present. But I also argue that we can't do this adequately without answering an even bigger question. You start to run out of superlatives at some point. And that bigger question is explaining the origins of historical and modern capitalism, because the first global economy rested on a historical capitalist base, while the second, of course, rests on a modern capitalist base. And the third component of NGP obviously is to advance a non-Eurocentric analysis of all this. And I have a specific conception in mind by that, which will become apparent very shortly. So until we make good on the deficiencies of Brit School IPE, which is what I try and do, and until we make it live up to its promises, we can't, in my view, make good on Cohen's laudable enterprise of bridge building. So a few words on Eurocentrism and what I call Eurofetishism, I think, are necessary before I can go into the narrative. Very quickly, Eurocentrism, it's a discourse that performs 4 key moves. So in the first, it separates West from East and imbibes them with a kind of autonomous, self-constituting property, and that they're separated off by sort of imaginary line of civilizational apartheid. The second property then elevates the West to the exceptional and superior status of civilization because it has rational institutions. The East is then downgraded into and then subdivided. So we get the second world of Oriental despotism, China, India, the Middle East, and the third world of savagery, Africa, Oceania, and before 1492, America. And they are demoted because they have apparently irrational institutions. Third, and perhaps most importantly, Eurocentrism subscribes to the Big Bang Theory. So this is a 2-step narrative. In the first step, the West makes itself all by itself. It breaks through to modernity without any help or influence from the non-Western world. Through the Eurocentric logic of imminence. It was imminent from the outset, from ancient Greece on, that this would inevitably happen. And then in the second step, the West expands outwards to remake the world in its image. And this begins after 1492 in the Americas, and then Asia, and it passes through formal empire, informal empire, to culminate in the kind of anchorman of this relay race, which is the United States, which trips the global light fantastic in 1945. But the bottom line is, in this story, is that all global agency is monopolized by the West. And the fourth point, which I only want to deal with very quickly, is that it does have a politics. In my 2012 book, I talked about pro-imperialism and anti-imperialism in Eurocentrism, and indeed in scientific racism. But I actually think it's probably fairer to say that Eurocentrism embraces either a direct or an indirect politics of imperialism, either a direct version, which is a paternalist civilizing mission conception to uplift the backward East, as in liberal empire in the 19th century, humanitarian intervention today, or it has an anti-imperialist politics, but inadvertently lets imperialism in through the back door because it embraces Western universalism. So the antidote to this is to look at the ways to bring in non-Western agency, which has been dismissed to core, and then also to look at how it shapes the West and the global economy, and indeed vice versa. Now, in the old days, I'd have finished my discussion of Eurocentrism there and moved on. But I can no longer do that because I've come to believe that there's a second approach here. And I first became aware of this quite a number of years after the piece was written. So it's a piece by Emmanuel Wallerstein, Eurocentrism and its Avatars, which came out in 1997. And it intrigued me because what it said is that a so-called non-Eurocentric approach, which seeks to bring in non-Western agency into the story of the modern world and its rise, as I do, he says, turns out to fall back into the trap of Eurocentrism. So for Wallerstein, the sole objective of a post-colonial approach is to prosecute the West in the academic court of social justice for its brutal capitalist imperial crimes against global humanity, which means that the West must be credited completely with the creation of capitalism and the global economy, and that non-Western agency must be erased from the picture outright. And here's why. Because if it turns out that the non-Western witnesses for the prosecution against the West played an important role in the creation of capitalism and the global economy, which becomes apparent through a deep interrogation by the West defense lawyer, then the case against the West collapses. So for Wallerstein, my highlighting of non-Western agency in this book serves in his imaginary to be playing the role of the West defense lawyer, or to act as an avatar of Eurocentrism. It is, of course, rather unedifying to see two non-Eurocentrics criticizing each other for being Eurocentric. And it's the type of thing that sort of glazes people's eyes over who don't know anything about post-colonialism. You know, I wish it was otherwise, but it is what it is, and I can't change that. So I call this approach critical Eurofetishism, because it fetishizes the West, just as Eurocentrics do. But it does that in order to critique the West, not to celebrate it, as of course the Eurocentrics do. But in the process, all the familiar hallmarks of Eurocentrism that I've just gone through, the Big Bang Theory, the notion of the self-constituting supremacist West, they're all reproduced in Eurofetishism. And my alternative narrative begins with the claim that the West has not been the only actor in the creation and development of the global economies, and it is simply a Eurocentric and Eurofetishist illusion to assume that it has. There are many other problems that I locate in Eurofetishism, too numerous to discuss here. But one of them is that it returns us to yet another binary conception of the world, this time around by painting the West as the brutal villain and the non-West as a kind of helpless, innocent, agency-less, passive victim. And I think that causes all sorts of problems. So as will become apparent when I start talking about what actually happened, or what I believe actually happened in the rise and development of global economies, one of my main objectives is to invert the Big Bang Theory. And I'll come back to that at the relevant points. So just to situate it, the book comprises 5 chapters in part 1. And these look at the rise and development of the first global economy. Chapter 2 considers the case of Chinese agency in the making of the global economy. China was important, but I don't believe that it was as important as Andre Gunder-Frank and Kenneth Pomerantz and other people at the California School have claimed it to be. So my focus is much more on India. And in fact, on what I'll call the Afro-Indian pivot of the first global economy. And that revolved inter alia around the role performed by Indian cotton textile exports. So this really is the guts of chapters 3 through 6. So Brett, if you don't mind putting up that slide so people can see it. Yeah, I assume people can see that. It is a bit bewildering to look at, but the purpose of this slide is less to bewilder and really to point out one simple point, which is that if you look at the gold-silver routes that traverse the first global economy that emanated from the Americas, from the New World, there were 16 passages. And if you include the ones that were not sourced from America, they're about 22 all up. And the only reason why I put this slide up is because A, it took me a hell of a long time to do, and B, it shows that the first global economy was quite interlinked, where especially silver threaded the global economy together. So the California School scholars tend to say that the majority of the silver plundered from the New World ended up in China, the China suction pump, as Flynn and Giraldus call it, or the China sink, silver sink, as Andre Gunder-Frank called it. And that was on the basis that at least 50, maybe even 75% of that silver ended up in China. There are all sorts of problems with that figure. But I would say that probably about 30% of the world's silver ended up in China, and somewhere around 20% ended up in India, net of the amounts that flowed on from India to China. And the reason why a lot of silver ended up in India was very simple. That was the main means of exchange to purchase Indian cotton textiles, and it was the main global trading commodity at the time. So let me come on to the role of Indian cotton textiles, which I argue wove this first global economy together. So Brett, if you don't mind, if you could put up slide 2. That's it. And you're on to Yeah, that's 2. Yes, correct. Okay. Again, another pretty down 1. That's it. That's it. Another complex diagram. But really all I want you to take away from this is that it was a 12-sided phenomenon. I'm going to call it ICT from now, Indian cotton textiles. It's just such a mouthful. So the ICT trading system was 12-sided, which I looked up on Google. It means it's a dodecagonal system. And it's spanned the entirety of the globe. So now I want to turn to introducing what I call the global Atlantic system. So, of course, we hear a lot from post-colonialists and Marxists about the triangular trading system. Britain and France, on the first point, went down to West Africa, bought slaves, went over to the New World on the third point, and then those products that they made were then returned back to Europe, thereby completing the triangle. My task in this particular chapter, chapter 3, is not to undermine their arguments, particularly those concerning the slave-based contribution to British industrialization, as I will mention briefly later, but rather to establish the point that the Atlantic trading system, the triangular trading system, was not sui generis. It was not self-constituting. It could not be described as a white Atlantic, as Eurocentrics would call it, nor a black Atlantic, as Paul Gilroy would call it. It was a kind of white, black, and brown Atlantic, probably just easier to call it the global Atlantic. So how was this the case? It's usually thought that when the British bought up slaves in Africa, their principal means of exchange were manufactured goods as well as guns. But actually, if we break down the export goods that the British used, it turns out that guns and gunpowder represented about 8% of the total in the 17th and 18th centuries, and manufactured goods about 11%. What mattered more were, first of all, slave-produced New World goods, rum and tobacco, about 16% of the total, but above all, ICTs. So cotton textiles in general comprised at least 50% of the exports to Africa. And in the first half of the all-important 18th century, 90% of these were ICTs. The question then is, why is it that ICTs were the major means of exchange to buy slaves? And the answer is that the Africans much preferred the superior ICTs to the inferior British products. I'll go into this in a little bit more detail shortly, but the British product was inferior because it was a fustian, part linen, part cotton. And the problem with linen is you can't wash it. And linen is also stiffer and more uncomfortable to wear. And if you want to host the bright colors that the ICTs hosted, you needed a pure cotton textile, which in the 1750s was still beyond the ability of the British to achieve. But as I say, I'll return to that. So focusing on the Afro-Indian pivot, the argument is as follows. First, ICTs have been exported to Africa since at least 1100, and it was from then on that the Africans developed a strong taste for them. So that when the British and other Europeans arrived in 1441, they found that to buy up slaves, they had to sell ICTs. The slavers were interested in very little else and not much that the British had to offer themselves. The slaves were then shipped to the New World, as we know, put it to work in the silver and gold mines and on the plantations where they produced various products and raw materials, which were then shipped back to Britain to help the British industrious and industrial revolution. So look, standing back from all this, you can see that Afro-India was actually the pivot around which so much of global economic activity revolved. And ICTs kind of were sort of global super commodity production and trading chain. Right? They enabled the production of other goods and they enabled the demand for other global commodities. So the ICTs bought the African slaves, who then, of course, produced the goods and raw materials, cocoa, sugar, tobacco, indigo, which is a dye, and of course, raw cotton. Without the ICTs, maybe the British would have found something else. That's a counterfactual that I can't answer, but the fact is they were the things that financed this whole project. The British in particular became very interested in drinking tea. in the 17th and 18th centuries. And one of the reasons why this was made possible is because they had Caribbean sugar to sweeten their tea with. And this also triggered the demand for Chinese porcelain because people wanted porcelain tea sets to drink out of. Not just the very wealthy, but this could be found in all sectors of society. A second implication of the Afro-Indian pivot concerns, and this is probably the most contentious part of the book, concerns the power and agential roles of the Africans, as they also linked up to West Asia via the West Asian slave trade. So Brett, if you don't mind putting up slide 3, that'd be great. So still a fairly complicated diagram, but actually not too difficult. Slide 3 shows that there isn't just one triangular slave trading system, as post-colonialists and Marxists always tell us. There were two, one in the Atlantic, one in the Indian Ocean. And if we focus on the right-hand side of slide 3, we can see the West Asian Muslims re-exported ICTs to Africa in order to buy up slaves. So they were in on the act as well. The slaves were then transported either directly to West Asia, where they were used in the army and domestic service and various other activities, or they were shipped directly to India, or they were passed on to India on the overland caravan routes more indirectly. So then what about the power and agency of Africans, West Asians, and Indian slave traders? Post-colonial and Euro-fascist analyses portray the Africans as just passive, helpless victims of European power, ruthlessness, and cunning. Walter Rodney is particularly relevant here in his well-known book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. He claims that the majority of the European imports into Africa were of the worst quality, even as consumer goods. Cheap gin, cheap gunpowder, pots and kettles full of holes, beads and other assorted rubbish. But I have to ask, does he really think that African consumers were really that gullible? And that African slavers who had captured and transported slaves over hundreds and hundreds of miles, undertaken all sorts of difficult and dangerous terrain, paid off local potentates to pass through their territory, were prepared to go through all of that just to buy up kettles full of holes? The fact is that the Africans had highly developed fashion taste. They weren't as primitive as Rodney and others would tell us. And in fact, they held the upper hand when negotiating with the British, not just in terms of the price of the slaves, which quintupled between 1700 and 1800 in real terms, but also the price of ICTs. And it's notable that British military power was next to useless in Africa. And one of the reasons why the African slavers were so savvy is that they'd been slave trading with the Muslims since about 700. They'd built up a vast infrastructure across Africa to engage in slave trading. Now, of course, some post-colonialists and Eurofascists would be shocked by my claim that the African slavers, the Africans, were complicit in the slave trade and would feel much more comfortable and would much prefer to lay all of the blame on the Europeans and the Atlantic slave trade. But they forget that the Africans had begun this process via the internal African slave trade even before the Common Era. It didn't begin with the Europeans. Not everything begins with the Europeans. And they did it as a means of getting rich. And they forget that Africans have been trading in slaves with another external agent, the West Asians, since about 700. So the African slave trade can't be just conflated with the Atlantic slave trade, as it so often is. And we hear almost next to nothing, even in really important books on Africa, written by post-colonialists and Marxists such as W.B. Du Bois, saying next to nothing about the West Asian slave trade, all of which is done because they fear the dilution of the critique of the European Atlantic slave trade if we dare utter the word the West Asian slave trade. The problem, though, is that ignoring the West Asian slave trade means that we sweep under the historical carpet the 11 to 14 million Black Africans, children, women, men. We sweep them away under the historical carpet as if this thing never happened. And if I'm going to be really harsh, I do believe that there is one thing worse than in this case, the West Asian slave trade, and that is to turn around decades later and claim that it never existed. Even so, my aim is not to distract attention away from the Atlantic slave trade. It seems to me that the Atlantic slave trade was more economically consequential to the first global economy than was the West Asian. It was also much harsher, unequivocally much harsher. And I could say all sorts of things about it. But in the end, the slave trade is a slave trade, and we can relativize it all we like, but it's still a slave trade. And the West Asian slave trade lasted from about 700 through to the 20th century. But please don't misunderstand me. My aim here is not to hang the West Asian Muslims out to dry for this. To somehow say, well, you know, the Europeans are doing this, the Muslims are doing it. Hey, everybody was doing it. What's the problem? Why all the beef about the Atlantic slave trade? That is the last thing on my mind, even if some people claim that unintentionally that is what I'm doing. But all I'm trying to do is show that West Asians also had power and also had agency. So did African slavers. And to pretend that they're just helpless innocent victims, I think is just doing them a disservice. There's all sorts of things I could say. I think I've been going for almost half an hour. And I need to move on quickly. There's all sorts of things I can say about the African Swahilis merchants on the East African coast and the relations they had with the various Indian Gujarati merchants, the Veneer, up till about 1840 and the Kachis thereafter. But I'm just going to leave that because I'm going to run out of time. I talk a lot about Indian structural power in the first global economy. And what I have in mind here is, again, countering the Eurocentric and Eurofetishist narrative that when the Europeans entered the Indian Ocean, they came, they saw, they conquered. Actually, when they entered the Indian Ocean and encountered the Japanese and the Chinese, they came, they saw, they kowtowed. With others, such as the Ottomans, the Safavid Persians, and India, they came, they saw, they cooperated. Of course, the Eurofetishist narrative likes to imagine European entry into the Indian Ocean system as kind of akin to an imperial tsunami that washes through and remakes the landscape and the seascape to suit the interests of the Europeans as they came to incorporate Asian societies into the emergent capitalist world economy. But I want to argue that, in fact, it's the Europeans who, in effect, became incorporated into the Asian system in significant part by Indian structural power. What do I mean by Indian structural power? One, ICTs were extremely popular around the world. They were in very high demand. And secondly, in large part because of the high demand for ICTs, so they became a means of universal exchange. And as I've already pointed out, slaves were purchased largely with ICTs, but ICTs could be used to buy just about anything. So what's this all got to do with incorporating the Europeans into the Indian Ocean system? We know from the standard narratives that the Portuguese launched their, Vasco da Gama launched his journey with hubristic dreams of conquering the Asians and subduing the Muslims and monopolizing the spice trade. But it wasn't long thereafter that they had a rude awakening. In essence, when they came to Southeast Asia to get hold of the spices that they lusted after, it turned out that the only thing the Southeast Asians wanted in return were ICTs. They weren't interested in anything that the Europeans had to offer. This meant that the Portuguese and then the Dutch and the English, following on in the 17th century, wormed their way into India, and they set up so-called factories in India. And where they did that, well, a whole bunch of names that I will spare you because of time limitations, but all of the factories were set up in major cotton textile producing towns and regions. And then they used those ICTs to finance their trade, their intra-Asian trade, the country trade, as is often called. And without those, they would have struggled to maintain their grip in Asia, Afro-Asia. So the assumption that somehow the British set out to conquer India from the outset is just a myth. They ended up there as a function of unplanned contingency, and that contingency was the unexpected need to access ICTs. So the European East India companies became sucked or pulled into India to buy up the ICTs. Also, I'd note that the East India companies in India didn't impose domination. It took a long time before that happened. It wasn't until the 19th century that the British were able to do that. And I'll say a few things about that later. But they entered partnership relations with the various Indian states, the Mughal Empire in the first instance, but very much as junior partners. And they found that they had to borrow money from wealthy individuals, such as Virji Vora, dealing with brokers, dealing with sarafs or bankers, sharing cargo on ships, all manner of things that they needed that they simply could not have done without. And the Marxist approach will always denounce such Indians as compradors. But these people had grown rich and powerful well before the British. The British needed them more than vice versa. Okay, so one particular interesting claim made by actually Pierre Vries, you might have come across his work, the nemesis of the California school. He says, India produced cotton textiles that were brought to the rest of the world by British traders who earned a lot of money in selling them. So basically, British producers were competing with British traders in Indian cotton. The Indians sat quietly at home and competed with no one in Europe. Wow. I've done, to the extent that it's possible, I've done a whole bunch of difficult guesstimates of trade that the Indians and Asians undertook in ICTs. These are very, very approximate, but I reckon that somewhere in the region in the 17th and 18th century, the volume of ICTs that was sold by Indians and Asians relative to the British was higher by an approximate factor of 30 in 1650, 18 in 1700, 9 in 1750, and 4 in 1800. And if we look at the share relative to all of Europe's trading in ICTs, I reckon the Indian and Asian share was higher by an approximate factor of 13 in 1650, 6 in 1700, 4 in 1750, and 2 in 1800. It seems to me that Asians and Indians in particular were vastly more important in trading ICTs than the British, but Eurocentrism tells us otherwise. And then chapter 6 looks at the kind of financial capitalism of the Indian traders, and I shall leave that aside, unfortunately, because time is getting away from me. So the main thing that I want to do is skip to chapters 9 and 10. Chapter 9 looks at the role of empire and the New World in industrialization. It returns to all the stuff that Eric Williams did, and I put a whole bunch of figures out there, sort of developing some of the work of Robin Blackburn and other people, and come out with various estimates, which in the end say that British industrialization was heavily based on the exploitation of the New World, partly colonial, partly non-colonial, because of course the raw cotton that the British relied on after 1793 from the southern United States, that was post-colonial times. But nevertheless, the overlapping factor there is the exploitation of black slaves, who were extremely important to all this. So the chapter I want to focus on in a little bit more detail is chapter 10. So if the chapter 9, the empire chapter, is the global production driver of British industrialization, and I should say that I look at industrialization because we need to know the origins of modern capitalism if we want to understand the second global economy, which is why I go into it. So if we look at chapter 10, that's the global Atlantic consumption driver, with Afro-India at its heart. So the story very quickly is as follows. In the 1670s, the English East India Company starts bringing ICTs to Britain, and very quickly it sets off the calico craze. Consumers love them. So much so that the wool and silk interests became very upset, petitioned the state to raise tariffs, which they did in the early 18th century in order to block out the ICTs. The unintended consequence of this, though, was a boon for Lancashire, because behind that tariff wall, Lancashire was able to develop, and indeed, as we know, develop it did, to become a major producer in the 19th century. Not the world's biggest producer in the 19th century. China was produced more than Britain, and it was only around 1900 that they matched each other. And British cotton textile production peaked around 1913, but a little later on, India and China and Japan came back to get their revenge and to lead them and to deindustrialize the British cotton textile industry. So up to the 1750s, the British developed their printing and dyeing, and they did this by copying Indian techniques. The problem was, and I return here to the fustians, the problem is that fustians are a very crude type of textile because of the linen in it. So what they need is to produce a pure cotton cloth. Why didn't they produce a pure cotton cloth? Answer, because their spinners were not skilled enough. The Indian spinners are extremely skilled, as indeed were the Chinese, particularly given that raw cotton in India and China was very weak. It took a Herculean effort to produce what is known as the warp. And I'm sorry to get technical, but if you look at a cotton loom, you'll see the vertical strands, that's the warp, and then you'll have the horizontal strand, the weft, that threads through the warp. The warp has to be strong because it has high tensile strength to hold in place so the weft can go through it. The only way the British could actually make a warp, a cotton warp, was with machines. And so we get the rise of the machines, the water frame and the mule in particular. Spinning jenny was not mechanized, the water frame and mule were. And then of course, Cartwright's power loom in 1785 completed this with mechanized weaving. The machines had a further advantage. The problem that the British had is they was not expensive labor, it's that they didn't have enough labor. 220,000 in the cotton mills around 1830. Compare that to about 6 million producers in India, 25 million in China. The only way they could match this was with machines. So the machines enabled them to, first of all, produce the pure cotton, and then, of course, to produce large amounts. So here I entertain the idea of it's a bit of a mouthful, the Afro-Indian cotton whip of external necessity, by which I simply mean that the British responded to the Indian cotton textile challenge through the process of uneven and combined development. Combined because they copied many of the Indian techniques, and then through late developer fashion, pushed ahead with the machines, which, you know, if you can talk about Western agency, that's something that needs to be taken into account. Either way, though, this was always a global affair. And if you read your standard economic history textbooks on the British Industrial Revolution, fascinating though they are, especially the documentaries, you'll only see the inside of a cotton mill or the inside of an iron steel factory if you're looking at the wider implications. It was always a global affair, and I don't think there's anything new I'm saying in that whatsoever. All I'm trying to do there is to bring out the role of Indian textiles in particular and Indian agency. Okay, so the final chapter, chapter 14, is a kind of overview, and I won't go into that. I just want to mention a few things about chapter 13, particularly as Jan had signaled this in his introduction. There I'm doing a lot of things, but what I'm doing is doing two things in particular. First of all, I challenged the deindustrialization thesis in the context of India and China. I think that Shashi Tharoor, much as I like his work, and much as I'm grateful to him for writing a puff on my 2004 book, I think the Indian nationalists fall into exactly the same trap as the Eurofetishists. They exaggerate the power of the almighty British and ironically understate the agency and resilience of the Indian weavers in particular. There's a whole story there. I'm more than happy to go into that in the Q&A. But I have been going for 40 minutes now. So let me just say a few things here. I also consider how, without the help of the Indians, and I can see why Indian nationalists will call them compradors. I completely get that. But I think it's too crude a concept. Without the help of the Indians in numerous ways, the British Empire, the Raj, would not have existed. The Indians could have expelled the British, but for various different reasons, they ganged up on their own, particularly Tipu Sultan in Mysore, at a particularly critical moment. So without that kind of help, the British Empire might not have existed in India, and that would have had huge consequences for the British Empire more generally. And that there were numerous groups of Indians and Chinese, Omani Arabs as well, who formed kind of competitive cooperative relations with the British in particular, but also synergistic relations. And they helped pull Britain in particular into the Indian Ocean and into spreading capitalism around the world, as much as there was a push factor by the British themselves too. So it was a much more complex situation than just a diffusion model of the West expanding outwards unproblematically, unchallenged, and so on. So here I'm really thinking about what I call the global multicultural contact zone, the zone in which they all meet, shape each other, and so on and so forth. Look, there are other things I could say, but I think I'm going to stop there because it's much more interesting to hear your questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, John. That's great. Please, Jerry, would you step in?
Okay. Let's see where. Okay, I don't have any slides, so it'll be very simple. First of all, I want to thank you, Jan, for inviting me to offer some comments on this presentation. I had already purchased a copy of the book. So, John, I trust you have a good royalty arrangement with the publishers.
Well, I'm feeling very guilty now. I should have sent you one. I'll sort something out.
No, absolutely not.
Bit late now. I'm sorry.
Unfortunately, I've only been able to read the first chapter with care. The rest I've just skimmed through. So most of my comments will be, most of what I have to say will be more about the first chapter. I have just 4 comments and a preliminary. The preliminary is that how we first became acquainted, John and I. When I was, it wasn't until more recently, but 50 years ago, 48 years ago to be precise, I published a book on economic imperialism. And one of the figures that I wrote about with a great interest was a John A. Hobson. So when many years later, I had occasion to write to John M. Hobson, I naturally asked the question that I'm sure he gets all the time, which was whether there was any connection. And I learned that, of course, it was that the John A. Hobson was John M. Hobson's grandfather. And I think this book demonstrates that genes are at work here. John A. Hobson's book was a classic, and my first point is that this too is a book that is destined to be a classic. I think it's a great book, and I just want to offer my sincere compliments. Congratulations on this accomplishment. This book has such a broad sweep of history, and it manages to combine an enormous amount of detailed empirical research with a broad strategic and theoretical view of all of the material. It's a book that I think is going to be seen in the future as part of a small coterie of books by people like Bob Cox, Manuel Wallerstein, and John M. Hobson. I really think this is a book for the ages. So that's my first point. I could stop there, of course, but I'll go on. My second point is a narrow, a small point, really a semantic point, but you're very careful in your presentation in chapter 1 and in the presentation today. You're very careful to give us a 4-part definition of what you mean by Eurocentrism, which is fine, except it seems to me that there's a risk here in your notion of Eurocentrism that you are both covering too much and too little. On the one hand, I wonder about the use of the Euro prefix because Europe was hardly a homogeneous participant in all of the events that you're talking about. There were Europeans and there were Europeans. And there were the British who don't even think of themselves as Europeans. And so I wonder if the euro is appropriate. On the other hand, you casually equate, it seems to me casual, that you casually equate Eurocentrism and the West, or Western thought. And that means the United States, I assume, is added to Europe. And that makes for even greater heterogeneity. I speak as the author of the article that was entitled, "Why Are British and American IPE So Different?" I think that there may be significant differences between a US view and a view from the dominant powers of Europe. So I just, I wonder if there could be a little more discussion of the appropriate labels. But that's a semantic point. Let me get to more substantive points. My third point has to do with what it is that you say that you are trying to do in this. And that is to offer a new GPE, a new global political economy. And you certainly can make the case that this is a new historical interpretation. But it's not clear to me. As I said, I've only been able to skim the bulk of the book, so it may be that you have discussions in there that I missed. But it seems to me that you are not giving enough credit to others who have preceded you in this kind of big history of GPE or IPE. I'm thinking, for example, you mentioned Payne and Gamble, you mentioned Murphy and Tooze, but there have been others. I think of Paul Langley, for example, wrote a book called World Financial Orders, in which he called for a new historical IPE. That was published around 2002, I believe. I think of the work of, more recently, of Eric Helleiner, who's doing a great deal of historical analysis, historical research on non-Western voices in the development of the study of the international economy. The new GPE, I think you're absolutely right in the message that you're trying to promote, that you successfully promote, the message that most studies of globalization or the global economy are highly Western-centric, or Eurocentric, as you put it, I'm quoting here. You're absolutely right to suggest that this is Western provincialism masquerading as the global universal. I love that line. That's one I'm going to quote sometime or other. The non-Western actors have been airbrushed out. You said you strike some good phrases in this way, but others have preceded you that I don't think are given credit in the book. I'm thinking of Arlene Tickner, for example, who I actually have a quote of hers from an article that she and David Blaney wrote, where they note the advantages that an early start gave the West in setting disciplinary standards. And they say, quote, scholarly communities outside the core operate largely in the shadow of an already existing IR, dominated by the West that occupies the top of the disciplinary ladder. I think they were making much the same point in the context of IR as you're making in the context of IPE. And there are others that I've come across over the years, like Ole Weaver and Tom Bierstecker. And I think that, in a sense, the central argument of your new GPE is pushing against an open door. And it seems to me might be useful in future writing to on the one hand, acknowledge that there have been others, and then on the other hand, make clearer what your unique contribution is on that. And then finally, my final point, and I think the biggest point, is what's the point? What's the what is it that you're trying to do here? I pulled out a number of phrases that in the rough text that you sent me to highlight the role of non-Western agency, to advance a non-Eurocentric analysis, to rehabilitate non-Western contributions, to explore the multiple manifestations of power and agency. All absolutely appropriate. But it's all history, strictly history, with no effort that I could find, no effort to say what the relevance of all of this is to the present day, let alone the future. Now, I tread on sensitive ground here because my wife is an historian and we often have discussions on this subject. But it seems to me that if one does history, that particularly if one is concerned about the world in which we live, it seems to me that there's some obligation to say what all this means for us today. And I really couldn't find that in the book or in the remarks that you offered us. So I would urge you in subsequent writing to enlighten us on what all of this really does to help us understand where we are today in the global economy and where we might be going. But again, I emphasize this is a great book, and I feel privileged to have the opportunity to comment on it.
Thank you.
Jerry, thanks a lot. John, you
sure. Well, I mean, I'm so grateful for your extremely kind comments. I'll be honest. I mean, my hunch is my biggest fear with this book is that people won't read it, and partly because of your final point, which I will come to in a moment. But I can't imagine IPE people, trudging through, all this historical stuff on stuff that I've spent too many years looking at and thinking about, which is really not what IPE people do. I can say IPE people should do it. Well, that's just me. They are more interested in the present, and that's fine, which does beg the question, so what? What's the point of all this? That's exactly right. Chapter 14 is an attempt to try and answer your question. So I sort of talk about, the 1500 to the 2020 period, and I bring up all sorts of things that we take for granted about the global economy today and show, how there's nothing new in it, how much of this started with non-Western actors and processes, to try and think differently about the way we tend to think about the present. Okay, so that's where I do all that. But look, you're right. The vast amount of work in this book is really going up to 1900, maybe slightly thereafter, when most IPE scholars perfectly legitimately want to look at the post-1945 world. And it is my regret that I didn't bring it up to the present. It is something.
Volume 2.
Yeah, well, actually, this is exactly what I want to do next. This and kind of doing the same for world politics, looking at the 20th century, but also having a historical framework. But it'd be more about the present and history giving you the different inflection rather than the other way around than it is in this book. But I feel that I share that with you. I think that's an absolutely fair point. Just very quickly, yeah, Eurocentrism. It's a little bit like East and West, and I used to talk about Eastern agency a lot, and people would say, well, East and West, you're buying into the old Eurocentric binary narrative. Well, these things don't actually exist in the way that we imagine them to exist, because they actually all shape each other in all manifold ways. And so when we talk about Eurocentrism, Eurocentrism really was a discourse to try and manufacture a sort of fake unity to Europe that frankly it didn't have. That's exactly why it was done at the time when Christendom was breaking down. Then, of course, if you conflate Eurocentrism and Europe as the West, then yes, you got the United States in. And of course, the United States has different ways of doing these things. Britain comes up with all sorts of good films, but they could never have made Star Trek, the original series. Fact. And yes, there are of course there are differences, but there are also similarities as well. You could argue that America today does engage in kind of paternalist civilizing missions, does engage in kind of liberal empire, by which I mean that Americans believe that when they go into humanitarian intervention situations, take out the despot, and then insert sort of Western states and Western economies, they believe they're doing the best thing. They believe that, and this isn't some kind of conspiracy. I don't believe. They actually believe this stuff, and that's fine. And it's one view, but there would be other views, and I think that paternalism is a lot of what the British Empire was about as well. They take different forms, formal, informal, but there are parallels there. All right. It doesn't look good to not adequately celebrate and acknowledge other people in the non-Eurocentric enterprise. This is going to sound like a hopeless excuse, but my bibliography was 25,000 words when I finished that book. And I eventually got the whole book down to 190,000 words. And one of the ways I did it was to rip out 12,000 words out of the bibliography. And I had some really big footnotes in the introduction chapter to all the post-colonialists that you've mentioned and many more. And I dropped them. And, some of them write to me and say, oh, I hear you've got this new book, I can't wait to read it. And my heart sinks because their reference has gone. And it was horrible, but I just couldn't see any other way of cutting it. And I know that sounds like a hopeless excuse, but people like Arlene Tickner, these were people I read right in the early days. Lily Ling was a really big influence on me. I think I squeezed some kind of citation to Lily somewhere, but I regret that. And a new global political economy is not meant to be a Hobson new global political economy. And I really hope it doesn't come across like that. It's simply trying to signal the need for the kind of big picture stuff that you talk about, but also the non-Eurocentric stuff. I'm not the first person to come along and do this. There have been plenty before me. You can go back to people like Marshall Hodgson back in 1974, before Edward Said, who was doing all this stuff. Jan's book, Emancipation and Empire, 1989. Honestly, an absolute gem of a book, light years ahead of me. Really, it was a brilliant book, and still is. So I'm sorry if it appeared that way, because it's the last thing I wanted to do. And so I don't know. What is the point? Without the detailed modern stuff, I totally accept your point, and I know I'm kind of repeating myself, but I would still say, look, where is post-colonialism in IR and IPE? Well, there's been an awful lot which tells us about how the discipline is Eurocentric, and I'm one of the offenders here. But what we do need to know is, right, well, what would a different, a non-Eurocentric approach look like to explaining the rise and development of the modern world? And that's what this book tries to do, and that's where I see my contribution. Limited though it is, because it doesn't deal properly in detail with the post-1945 world. I think that's how I'd see it. But I'm probably just repeating what I said in the intro.
John, thanks. Jerry, thanks. Please, let's have a wider conversation. People come in with questions now. That would be great. Where do I see? Oh, Regenia, please. And Regenia and then Swarupa. Yeah.
Okay, hi. Thank you. I liked your talk very, very much. I also very much liked what you just said, the way that you responded to Cohen's response. But I'm here in the UK, and I do know a lot of people who know the literature of the cotton famines, and they have worked always on the textile industry in Britain. And I'm wondering, because I also have a lot of South Asian collaborators that I work with where we talk about processes of transculturation that are much like the kinds of things you talk about. But what I don't know is there an industry of literature that comes out of, let's say, Gujarat, as there is out of the cotton famines in Britain? Is there an actual literary and cultural industry that comes out of that we can understand those transcultural processes in the way that we do in Britain?
Please, please, can we combine this with another question so we do it a bit faster? Swarupa, please.
Thank you so much for your talk. It was really interesting. I had a rather broad question. So we spoke about the cotton traders, but I was wondering, what were the reactions of the cotton peasants, the peasants who produced the raw cotton, when suddenly cotton became valuable or ICTs became valuable? So
Sorry, could you repeat the question? I was just distracted, sorry.
No problem. So I was wondering, what was the response of the cotton peasants in India, people producing raw cotton?
The response to what, the British?
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Please, John.
Right. Okay. So, sorry. So Regina, am I pronouncing your name? Yeah. Thank you for your question. So I take it that you're wondering if there was more to India's contribution than just the Indian cotton textiles. Is that what you mean? And in this case,
No. I mean, I know.
Is there a literary tradition of?
I know the effects. I know the effects of this on South Asian producers. I'm actually asking, do you know about a literature? A literature, as we have cotton famine poetry, we have cotton famine fiction, we have all kinds of literary culture that came out of these international trade relations. I'm wondering if you had ever come across in your work anything that would be similar in Gujarat or any of the other South Asian states that we could work with.
Oh, that's a really interesting question, and here I have to confess that I'm no historian. You know, I have the very untrendy sort of disciplinary locus of being a sort of global historical sociologist who happens to end up in an IPE department and doesn't always convince as a result. But I'd love to know that actually, but I'm sorry, I don't.
Okay, I hope we have further contact then at some point.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You probably know an awful lot more about this stuff than I do, quite frankly. So with Swarupa's comment, yes. So I'm guessing that you're wondering about my depiction of the critique of the deindustrialization thesis. And, you know, so British cotton textiles start going into India. They really only become significant after 1850. And always the story is told that, you know, this was the death knell for the Indian weavers whose bones lie bleached on the plains that Lord Bentinck talked about and Karl Marx picked up on. But I think that as a generalization, it's highly problematic. And there are several reasons for this. First of all, it is true that British made cotton textiles entered India in increasing numbers throughout the second half of the 19th century, but it wasn't a zero-sum game. It wasn't all these imports come in and therefore wiped out the domestic producers. What actually happened is that demand doubled in the second half, and I believe doubled again sort of 1890 to 1920. which means that actually, if you look at domestic Indian production in the 1820s, 30s, 40s, it dropped 5, maybe 10%. It dropped more precipitously in the 1870s by about 20% and 35% in the 1880s, but thereafter it recovered. And the reason why is, yes, a lot of cotton spinners suffered, but that's because they ended up becoming cotton weavers to carry on because demand was so high. Some of them also, even the Deccan spinners came to rely on English spun cotton, not because it was better, because it wasn't, but because it was cheaper. Even in 1935, even after the cotton mills had started in India, even in 1935, that 80% of producers were handloom weavers. Only 20% of cotton was made in the mills. And one reason for that is because the mills specialized in particular types of products. But the Indians were really flexible and they produced their own styles that the mills did not compete with. So there are all sorts of things going on here. But this kind of devastating tsunami type conception of British cotton textiles wiping out India, I think Indian cotton textile production is just wrong. The British did all sorts of bad things in India. We could talk about quite a lot of that, but they never had the power to undermine the textile industry. The Indian weavers were far more resilient and had more agency than that. And that is always the casualty in the kind of Euro-fetishist come Indian nationalist position. They, if I may say, they do their own selves down far too much. So I don't know if that helps, but I do talk about that in chapter 13, first third or something.
Yeah, very good. Please, Daniel, and then Regenia again, please.
Yeah, thank you for the chance asking my question. And thank you for this great overview of trade relations. I was interested in the link between the trade relations you made up and the change in production that we can observe on the ground in Britain, right? So you somehow alert a little bit, if I understood you correct, the argument is somehow that this was the way the British could compete to export cotton products, right? I was just wondering, really out of curiosity, but also because there is literature on this, if there's not more at play in England there, where there might be the need to consider that there was a unique process that enabled this mass production that turned into machinery and factory building at that scale in this short period of time, right? So maybe this link in between international relations and the changes in productions in Britain, you could elaborate a little bit more for me. Thanks.
Oh, and then Regenia, you want to combine with Regenia? Is that okay?
That was only a legacy hand. I'm sorry, I've taken it down now.
Okay, sorry. Please, John.
Yeah, no, another really good question. So where I went wrong, I think, in an earlier book I wrote called Deindustrialization, it was and Jan's talked about this. In fact, I quoted him to this effect that the problem with much of the California school is it tends to reverse the binary. So instead of Western agency and non-Western non-agency, it reverses it, and suddenly China in the California school becomes the be-all and end-all. And I certainly succumbed to that. The trick is to be able to look at the global factors that made things possible and change things, but also factor in domestic sources of change too. And I think that's what you're getting at, Daniel. And certainly, I talk about this in really in chapters 12 and 13, which I didn't get, 11 and 12, which I didn't get a chance to talk about. But there were many things going on in Britain. Why did Britain industrialize and why did China and India not? And I even go so far as to sort of not stand on its head, but change my earlier position. I think a lot of post-colonialist non-Eurocentrics always like to believe that, China and India were on their way to industrialization, but those nasty British came along and ruined the party. Again, I think they ascribe a little bit too much power to the British. I don't believe that China and India were on a path into industrialization. That's not to say that they were incapable of doing it. And I could wax lyrically about the Chinese big spinning frame for Ramey, which could have been converted into a spinning machine, and it wasn't. And there were good reasons why it wasn't, but it could have been. And had it been, when it was invented in the 13th century, you might have had a cotton industrialization in China, but it didn't happen. And there are many reasons here, but in terms of British agency, which you're really asking me, I think that what Jack Goldstone and other people have talked about when it comes to the kind of mechanical culture was really important. Now, there was a mechanical culture in India and especially China, in China for 2,000 years. But in Britain, it cut in hard, sort of in the Enlightenment period after 1700. And it was all about machines would transform the world, you know, the classic Enlightenment thing, really. And the irony is, though, that most of the inventors of the cotton machines had no scientific knowledge whatsoever. But what they were part of was a mechanical culture that just obsessed about machines, and they were going to find a machine for everything. If you look at James Watt, then science was quite important to the rise of the steam engine. You know, I don't think the steam engine caused the British Industrial Revolution, because I think things were going on well before then, but it consolidated it because it was that, you know, I mean, the cotton mills were run on water power, but when the steam engine came in, they were able to bang out a lot more. Ditto iron and steel production, in particular, steam engines were vital for that. So, you know, in inventive terms, there were many other things too. I mean, if you're going to look at the empire, you know, although the British were dependent on Africans and Indians and other Asians to enable that empire to happen, without the Indian army, they'd never have had an empire, because that's the thing that expanded the British Empire around the world. But in the end, it wasn't just that the British had an empire. The French had an empire, but they didn't industrialize first. And others have done in the past and didn't industrialize. It was the way they used that empire that enabled them to industrialize. And there were many aspects here that I could go into, but I'll leave them aside. I'll talk about those in chapter 9. But you know, there was a combination of British agential factors that made all this possible, from the state down to inventors and so on. So I don't know if that answers your question, Daniel, but you know, that is an important part of the argument.
John, I see a question by Ashish, David, and also myself and Charmaine. We have to be a bit brief, folks. Ashish. Sound.
Thank you, John. This was fascinating. So very quick, simple question. Indian cotton textiles were obviously very highly valued at the time, and yet no one else seemed to be trying to jump on the bandwagon and figure out how to make this. What was the barrier that prevented the production of these things from globalizing rather than just the trade?
Then next question, David, please.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ashish. I really liked your question too. John, it looks like an amazing, critically important contribution here. You have some folks who have preceded you, and I'm thinking of William McNeill, and of course he's rather Western-centric. However, he did have a series of lectures entitled Polyethnicity and National Unity in World History that I think touches on some of what you have here. And of course, Sven Beckert with Empire of Cotton and Dalrymple with the Anarchy, and of course Jan's book on emancipations have all kind of preceded you. And I'm wondering how those have contributed to your work.
I will slip in a quick question. Say, John, if we consider then the Asian lead in production and in trade of 1,000, 2,000 years before the Europeans or the West, how then do you account for this 200-year interlude of Western and Euro leadership, 1800-2000, because if we understand that, we can begin to get a deeper perspective on the rise, the comeback of the East in the 21st century. We'll see then the strengths and the limitations of the Euro episode. So then, Charmaine, please, if you combine questions, Charmaine, please.
Hi, John. Thank you. And I'm sorry you have to answer 4 questions in one go. I'm going to try to be brief. I'm wondering if I could ask you for more clarity on what you call the kind of critical Eurofetishism of the post-colonial literature. You say that it's about a kind of desire to prosecute the West and that non-Western agency is erased in the process. But I think the account you've given so far doesn't deviate that much for me from what I understand post-colonial scholarship in the IR to say, which is not that the West was superior, not that it was about superior technology or goods, but that it was specifically about the kind of role of the powerful state as a distinguishing feature of Western imperialism that enabled piracy, enslavement, the appropriation of technology, and so forth. So in a way, the way you set up post-colonial scholarship to say that it's about reifying the certain notion of a Eurofetishism doesn't quite fit with what I understand post-colonial scholarship to do, which is to critique, which is not to reify its superiority, but to critique the unique way in which imperialism took place as a process. And that story doesn't feel necessarily that distinct from the account you've given. So I guess what I'm asking to kind of shorten the question is, what is your understanding here of non-Western agency when you say that the kind of aim of the book is to restore a non-Western agency? Who are the agents in this case? And in what ways is this, I suppose, different from the ways in which post-colonial scholarship is trying to give an account of the West's unique place in its kind of coercive power, militarily and capitalist otherwise? Thanks.
Please.
Wow. Wow, great questions. Right, I better move quick. Ashish, why did not others readily copy ICTs? Good question. I mean, I think to an extent they tried to. I think Southeast Asians did, though they developed their batik. Others, Africans, were developing their own cotton textiles many, many centuries ago, going back to the early part of the first millennium. But in the end, it was the British that decided that they wanted to really compete with this. I don't think I'm going to do a good job of answering your question, Ashish, because I'm probably just going to end up repeating what I've said. But it is a really good question. Why didn't others get on the bandwagon, you know, to anything like the same extent? I mean, I would say that China should be considered here, because actually China produced a lot more cotton textiles than did the Indians. The difference was that the Indians exported actually probably only around 8% of their textiles, but that alone was a huge amount. And I've gone into breaking down the figures as to how many people in the world could wear a cotton shirt and all the rest of it, and I won't bore you with all that. But no, the Chinese were actually probably the most successful and had the biggest market internally in the world. I mean, one part of China, the lower Yangtze Delta, was producing as much as the whole of India in the 19th century. It is absolutely phenomenal. Anyway, why they didn't export it would be the real question, and they only exported very, very small amounts between 1760 and 1830, essentially, and then started again after 1850. But great question. I'm sorry, I really don't think I've answered it very well. David, yeah, great question, and thanks for your kind comment. William McNeill, I mean, yeah, sure. I mean, I've read so much of his stuff. I'll confess that I haven't read the whole of The Rise of the West from cover to cover, but I've read large chunks of it, and I've read quite a few of his other books, Plagues and People, and quite a few others. And yeah, absolutely, it's influenced me. It explicitly influenced me in various different chapters, which become apparent. And I liked his opening early chapter on China, which I think triggered all sorts of things in my own work, going back 2 decades now. Sven Becker, I use quite a bit in the book. I think it's a great book. I don't think that's in question, but it wasn't always doing what I wanted it to do. And I did sense kind of Eurofetishism involved in there, which yeah, I wasn't thrilled by. Jan's book, Emancipation Empire. I mean, he thinks I'm saying all this because he's here, but that was just an amazing book, way ahead of its time. And I think I only really became properly aware of it right at the end of writing my Eastern Origins book. But yeah, that was just an amazing book. Okay, and there have been loads of other people who've influenced me, and I regret giving any impression that that might not be the case. Going back to Marshall Hodgson, I plowed through tons of that, and Janet Aberlugod, and the list is endless. So, you know, I do want to emphasize New Global Political Economy is not Hobson New Global Political Economy. It's just putting a name to what loads of people have been doing for a very long time. Charmaine, look, really good question. And as you said all that, it struck me. I'm really not trying, and I think I've given a mistaken impression here. With my obsession with Eurofetishism, I've kind of given an impression that I'm seeing a lot of post-colonialism in that light, when in fact I'm not. And my own non-Eurocentric approach is not mine. There are lots of other people who have done this kind of thing. In fact, I mean, the only people I could find that made a really clear discussion of this thing I'm calling Eurofetishism, Wallerstein's piece that I mentioned, and a piece that Alina Sajid and Naomi Ayatollah did when they critiqued one of my earlier books. And it was word for word, it was verbatim Wallerstein's 1997 argument. And at that point I thought, oh my God, there's something here. There's a kind of category here. And I think that quite a few IRIP people, when they do the post-colonialism, do this kind of Eurofetishism. It's all about, if I can say it, hanging shit on the West, non-stop, ad infinitum. And I'm not here to defend the West. I'm not interested in that at all. I'm interested in looking behind the shadow of empire and inside the shadow of empire and finding all these so-called non-Western agents who have made a difference to the world, but who have not been celebrated, who have not been revealed before, who have just been dismissed. And I find that Eurofetishism unequivocally does that. And that abrades with my politics, to be honest. And so who are these non-Western agents? Well, a lot of them were kind of merchants, but, you know, the Indian weavers, the Chinese weavers, you know, I've got a quote in there about how the Indian weavers changed the course of history, you know, and a lot of these were women and really important, but just unsung, unnoticed, disappears in the shadows. African slavers, I count as agents. So when I'm talking about agents and agency, it's not all necessarily, you know, the resistance agency that post-colonialists love to talk about in that kind of Manichean way. You know, the power and agency of West Asian Muslims and slavers, military power that they engaged in, all sorts of forms of power that are not unique to the West. And I'm not trying to equalize the historical record to make the non-West look bad as the West. That's not my aim at all, though I understand that some people will perceive it as such. But to me, non-Western peoples are, last time I checked, human beings. And as human beings, they can do good, they can do bad, and occasionally they can do evil. Humans are flawed. Why are they any different? Really, is it that much of a revelation to ask that question? But they're not. And so, you know, we can get into all sorts of deep cultural analysis, and I'm not trying to voluntarize this into kind of, in some sort of individualistic way, but I'm trying to restore that sense. If my politics is to restore that dignity that has been taken away by scientific racism and Eurocentrism. And, you know, I think that Eurofetishists have the heart in absolutely the right place, and they're doing some important stuff. I'm not dismissing them, but I think that leaving out this side of things is the problem I have.
John, I think your work is such a great synthesis of many strands. What a wonderful account you give of agency that has been uncovered, which then raises the question, gosh, how was this agency organized? Not everything has to be addressed here. So, John, thanks very much for the wonderful opportunity to meet up again. Jerry, thank you very much for your comments also.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Thanks everybody for your questions and your joining in. Thanks very
Thank
much.
you so much.
Hi. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
All right.
Thank you. That was
We
great.
talk later, John. All right.
Sure,
Super.
sure, Jan. Take care now.
Thanks.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Outstanding work there, John.
Yes.
Oh, thank you. That's really kind.
Thanks. Really. Yes.